So the story of Central Africa involves a British explorer named Livingstone and a U.S. reporter named Stanley. Now, Livingstone was a world famous explorer. He was a superstar. He had made multiple trips to Africa. He had written multiple books about his trips, and his books became bestsellers. So he was this huge hero. He was an international star. And the Royal Geographical Society hired Stanley to find the source of the Nile River. Right? Now, Livingstone was interested in finding navigable rivers because he thought if you could find easier ways into Central Africa, European trade would enter into Central Africa, and that would give an alternative source of income so people would turn away from the slave trade in Central Africa. He despised the slave trade. He was a very devout Christian. He also thought if you could find navigable rivers, that would make it easier for Christian missionaries to spread the gospel. Well, on this trip, trying to find the source of the Nile, he goes missing. No one heard from him, and so it becomes this huge story. Because remember, he is an international hero. He was world famous, and he went missing. That's where Stanley comes into play. Stanley was sent by his newspaper to find what happened to Livingstone because it would make a huge story. And it turns out that Livingstone had been stricken with a severe illness, and he was stuck in this village being nursed back to health. And eventually, Stanley found him, and Stanley writes about it because he was a reporter, and he talks about how when he saw Livingstone, he was so excited he wanted to run up and give Livingstone a huge hug, but he realized that would be improper for gentlemen to do, so he simply shook his hand and said, "Dr. Livingstone, I presume." So Stanley now becomes super famous as the man that found Livingstone. And interestingly enough, when Stanley basically told Livingstone, "All right, pack up your things, we're going to go back home, right? I'm going to bring you back home to Britain," Livingstone refused because he still had not found the source of the Nile. And Livingstone will never leave Africa. He will pass away a few months later. And he was so respected by the Africans that he had befriended that those Africans cut out the heart of Livingstone and buried it in Africa. So his heart would always remain in Africa. And then they preserved the body and marched his body from Central Africa to the coast free of charge. It took months and months and months of very dangerous travel for these Africans to do that, but they respected Livingstone so much because Livingstone, unlike a lot of Europeans, now Livingstone still had his hang-ups. There was still some racism in Livingstone. It was that time period, but if you read his words and you read the words of Africans that had dealings with Livingstone, he treated them far differently than the average European or American did. He treated them with a great amount of respect for that time period. So Stanley, as I said, he becomes famous and he starts to explore as well. And he tries to shop around the idea of settling Central Africa, but no one will take him up on that offer except for Belgium. Belgium eventually settled Central Africa. That's why it was called the Belgian Congo, and that would be the only territory in Africa that Belgium possessed. Now, East Africa, that too is interesting. You look at the map of East Africa, it was almost completely owned by Britain. Britain's that pink color. And as you can see, you could almost go from Egypt all the way down to South Africa without leaving British territory. It was called Cape to Cairo. Cape Town was in South Africa, Cairo was in Egypt. You could almost go Cape to Cairo without leaving British territory. Unfortunately, Germany claimed part of East Africa, and as you could tell, that broke up the process. And instead of going to war with Germany over East Africa, there was this big conference held in Berlin called the Berlin Conference, where the leading European countries gathered together to decide how to divide up Africa. And at this Berlin Conference, there were no African delegates, which is a symptom of that social Darwinism and racism we talked about in section 1. Europeans did not invite African delegates because they didn't care what the African delegates had to say, because why would they listen to them? right? They're white Europeans, so they know better. That's what this political cartoon is about. You can see Otto von Bismarck there standing up with a knife, and they're about to divide Africa up. Right? Now, Otto von Bismarck, side note, thought this whole idea of a German empire was ridiculous. He only did it because the German people wanted it. He thought it was a stupid idea, but it kept the German people happy to know that Germany had a little bit of an empire. So these white Europeans, they gather in Berlin and decide on their own how to divide up Africa. And you see other symptoms of racism as well when you look at what happens in South Africa, which we'll look at in our next video.